Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. It was a typical Friday afternoon when my wife, Sarah, and I loaded up the car to drive out to the mountains for a weekend away. I thought it'd be a nice escape, a chance for us to reconnect. But everything changed the moment we stopped at a Wawa station for a break. As Sarah stepped out to use the restroom, she left her phone on the seat next to me. I wasn't snooping, I swear I wasn't. But as it buzzed to life beside me, I glanced over without thinking. The name that appeared on the screen, Andrew, work, didn't ring a bell. I dismissed it as just some office message. But when Sarah came out of the store and saw her phone in my hand, she bolted over in a way that sent a shockwave through my chest. I'd never seen her sprint like that. She grabbed it out of my hand with an odd smile, something between sheepishness and panic, and said, "It's just work stuff." "Work stuff?" I asked, half laughing. I didn't think much of it until I caught her glancing nervously at me out of the corner of her eye as we drove away. She was being weird about it, fidgeting, trying too hard to play it cool. My stomach churned. I didn't want to start a fight over what could have been nothing, so I filed it away in my mind. The weekend went on, and I pushed down that lingering feeling, telling myself that I was being paranoid. We laughed, shared meals, and tried to relax. But every time she looked down at her phone, that shadow of doubt crept back in. It didn't help that she'd step away to take a call, or suddenly get tired and retreat to the bedroom, phone in hand, leaving me to sit alone by the fire. I was her husband, but I felt like a stranger in her presence. When we got back home, the doubts I'd tried to suppress on our trip exploded into something else entirely. I found myself up late at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to connect dots that weren't there. What was it about that phone? Why had she been so quick to take it from me? And who the hell was Andrew? One night, as she slept, I reached for her phone, my heart pounding in my ears. But, of course, it was locked, and I didn't know the passcode. I returned to bed, feeling stupid, ashamed even, for letting my mind spiral like this. But in the morning, I watched her closer, looking for anything unusual. I told myself I was just being cautious, that it was natural to have doubts once in a while. But each day, that doubt gnawed deeper. 2 weeks later, she was heading out again, this time for a late-night work dinner. The story was thin, and her nervous laugh as she explained made me want to shake her and scream, "What's going on?" Instead, I forced a smile and nodded, feeling something inside me crack. That night, as I paced the house alone, I finally broke. I was done letting my mind be a battleground for questions without answers. So I took a different approach. I logged into our phone account online and checked her call history. My gut sank as I scrolled. Andrew's number, with a Virginia area code, popped up repeatedly, sometimes at the oddest hours, 1 a.m., 11:45 p.m., even during our weekend away. It was more than work, it was way too frequent to be professional. My head was spinning, and the tightness in my chest made it hard to breathe. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I started tracking everything. Every late-night call, every work dinner, every urgent meeting. I kept my distance, hiding the storm of emotions that was tearing me apart. I wanted to lash out, to confront her right then and there, but I knew better. Sarah was the kind of person who could talk her way out of anything, turn it back on me, twist my words until I was the one apologizing. Not this time. This time, I'd get the proof before I made my move. A few weeks into my silent investigation, Sarah asked me why I'd been so distant. She stood in the kitchen, her arms crossed, trying to catch my gaze. But I just shrugged, muttered something about work stress, and avoided looking her in the eye. I could tell it rattled her a little, made her uncomfortable. But I wasn't ready to let her off the hook. I wanted her to feel the same doubt, the same cold fear that I'd been living with. It became a dance, her avoiding certain topics, me keeping my responses short, both of us pretending everything was fine. The nights I'd usually spend watching movies together or planning little weekend trips, I now spent combing through her digital life, looking for the smallest clue, the slightest slip. Each discovery hurt more than the last, but I was past the point of retreat. I'd chosen my path, and I was going to see it through. Then, late one night, I found it. A message that hadn't been erased yet. It was short, just a few lines, but it was all I needed. Tonight was perfect. I miss you already. Andrew's name sat at the top of the screen. My hands trembled as I stared at the message on Sarah's phone. Tonight was perfect. I miss you already. I don't know how long I stood there, rereading those words. They seared into my mind, leaving a burning ache in my chest. I was standing at the kitchen counter, alone, staring at the screen like an idiot. It was the proof I'd been looking for, but it was also a nightmare come to life. I don't remember going back to bed that night. I just drifted in and out of thought, picturing her in the arms of some stranger, telling him all the things she used to say to me. I wanted to confront her right then, to grab her phone and demand the truth. But instead, I lay down beside her, feeling my world tilt out of focus. I'd waited so long for answers, but now that I had one, it left me hollow. The next morning, I watched her move through the house as if nothing was wrong, blissfully unaware that I knew everything. It was almost surreal, like we were living in two different worlds. She sipped her coffee, scrolling through her phone with that same indifferent look she always had. The look I'd once found comforting now felt cold, calculated. I'd never noticed how distant she looked when she thought I wasn't watching. After she left for work, I sat in silence, trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to pack her things, throw them on the front lawn, and end this mess once and for all. But the rational part of me, the part that had been keeping a steady head through all of this, told me to wait. Rushing into a confrontation might backfire. She was too good with words, too quick with excuses. No, I needed something bigger, something that would make sure she couldn't talk her way out of this. I spent the day in a haze, half-heartedly working from home but unable to concentrate. Every time I glanced at the clock, I wondered if she was texting him, telling him she missed him, arranging their next meeting. My mind churned through 1,000 scenarios, each more painful than the last. I was spiraling, and I knew I needed to get control before I did something reckless. That night, I tried to act normal. We sat down for dinner, and she told me about her day with the usual anecdotes about her coworkers. I nodded, barely listening, my mind miles away. She seemed more relaxed than usual, maybe even happier. I couldn't help but wonder if it was because of him, if he was the reason she'd been smiling more lately. The thought twisted in my gut like a knife, but I forced myself to smile back, pretending I didn't know. It went on like this for days. I'd go through her phone whenever I had the chance, reading every message, every exchange. Each one was like a small stab, a reminder of just how far we'd fallen. She was careful, though, never saying too much, never leaving any real evidence that could blow things open. They spoke in codes, little phrases that wouldn't mean much to anyone else. But I knew, and that knowledge was a heavy weight I carried with me every day. Then one evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, she got up to make a call. She said it was work, a quick check-in with a client. But I knew better. I followed her quietly, listening from the hallway. Her voice softened as she spoke, that same tone she used to use with me. My hands clenched into fists, and I had to fight the urge to burst into the room and confront her. Instead, I waited, counting down the minutes until she hung up. That night, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I needed a plan, a real plan, one that would let her feel the same betrayal, the same pain. She needed to understand what it felt like to be blindsided, to have your trust ripped away. And I knew just the way to do it. Over the next few weeks, I became more detached, pulling back from her bit by bit. I stopped joining her for dinner, stopped talking about my day. She noticed, of course, and started asking questions, but I brushed them off, telling her I was busy with work. It wasn't a complete lie, I was working harder than ever to make sure I had everything in place. I wanted to make sure that when the time came, there would be no loose ends, no way for her to weasel out of it. One night, I gathered all the evidence I had. The messages, the call logs, the strange transactions on her credit card. I compiled them, laying them out neatly in a folder. Each piece felt like a brick, building a wall between us that she'd never be able to tear down. I knew she'd try to explain, to beg and plead, but I was past caring. This wasn't about salvaging anything, it was about ending things on my terms. By the time I finished, it was late, and the house was silent. I sat in the dark, staring at the folder, feeling a mix of satisfaction and sorrow. This was what my life had come to, a collection of lies and betrayal. I thought about our wedding day, the promises we'd made, and felt a wave of anger rise up. How could she do this? How could she look me in the eye, lie to my face, and pretend nothing was wrong? The next morning, I put my plan into action. I was distant, colder than usual. She noticed, asking if everything was okay. I just shrugged, telling her I had a lot on my mind. I could see the worry in her eyes, the uncertainty. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of guilt, but I pushed it down. She deserved this. She'd brought this on herself. That evening, I invited her to sit down with me in the living room. She looked confused, maybe even a little nervous. I sat across from her, watching her face, taking in every detail. This was the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd trusted with everything. But now, all I saw was a stranger, someone who had betrayed me in ways I couldn't forgive. "Sarah," I began, my voice steady. "I know." She blinked, tilting her head. "Know what?" "About you and Andrew." Her face fell, the color draining from her cheeks. I watched her expression change, shifting from confusion to shock to something that looked almost like fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I know everything," I continued. "The messages, the calls, the late nights. All of it." She stammered, struggling to find the right words, but I didn't let her. I handed her the folder, watching as she opened it, her hands trembling. She looked down, her eyes scanning the pages, each piece of evidence cutting into her like a blade. I could see the realization dawning in her eyes, the horror of being caught. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do it?" She looked up at me, tears pooling in her eyes, but I didn't feel a shred of sympathy. She'd made her choices, and now she was going to face the consequences. I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," I replied, my tone cold. "And now you're going to live with that." She sat there, staring at the stack of evidence in front of her, looking like someone who'd just been told the world was ending. Her hands trembled as she tried to pick up one of the pages, her eyes darting across it, realizing how deep I had gone to unearth her betrayal. For a few minutes, there was nothing but silence between us, thick and stifling. I could see the wheels turning in her mind as she fought to find some way out, some excuse, but she knew as well as I did, there was no escaping this. Her voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything, Sarah." I crossed my arms, forcing myself to stay calm, to keep the cold edge in my voice. "There's nothing you can say that would change what you did." A flicker of defiance crossed her face as she tried to meet my eyes. "It's not what you think." It wasn't serious." I almost laughed. After everything I'd found, all the messages, the lies, she had the audacity to sit there and tell me it wasn't serious. "So you're telling me you threw away our marriage, our family, for something that wasn't serious? That's your defense?" She swallowed, her gaze falling to the floor. "I didn't throw it away. I needed something for myself." "For yourself," I repeated, letting the words sink in. And what about me? What about our family? Did you think about us while you were sneaking around with him? Tears welled up in her eyes, and she covered her face with her hands, a quiet sob escaping her. I didn't want to hurt you. I swear, I never wanted this to happen. I leaned forward, keeping my voice steady. Sarah, do you even understand what you did to me? To us? You lied to me, over and over. And for what? A few moments of excitement? Some meaningless fling? It wasn't like that. She looked up, her voice shaking. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I don't even know how it started. I just felt so empty. And he was there. He made me feel like I mattered. Like you mattered? I shook my head, incredulous. So I didn't make you feel like you mattered? The years we spent together, the life we built, that wasn't enough for you? She was quiet, her shoulders slumping, the weight of her guilt evident in every inch of her. I don't know how to explain it. I never stopped loving you, I got lost. And Andrew, he filled that void. The anger that had been simmering inside me boiled over. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to keep myself from shouting. So that's it. I was just supposed to understand. To be okay with this because you felt lost. Do you even realize what you've done? Her voice was a barely audible whisper. I'm so sorry. Sorry isn't going to fix this, Sarah. I turned to face her, my fists clenched, the pain cutting through me like a blade. You destroyed everything we had. You destroyed us. She sat in silence, her tears falling freely now, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. The person I'd loved, the person I thought I knew, was gone. In her place was someone I barely recognized, someone who had thrown away our life together for a lie. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy. Is there any way we can fix this? I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet room. Fix this? Sarah, how do you fix something like this? You can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to the way it was. You betrayed me, over and over. That's not something you can just erase. She looked down, wiping her eyes. But we have a family, Michael. Think of the kids. Don't they deserve a chance? Don't we owe it to them to at least try? The mention of our kids cut through me. It was the one thing that held me back, that kept me from walking out the door right then and there. I thought about them, about how they'd be caught in the crossfire of all this, and it broke my heart. But I couldn't let her use them as a reason to stay, as an excuse to sweep this under the rug. They deserve honesty, Sarah. They deserve parents who respect each other, who don't lie and cheat. What kind of example are we setting if we pretend everything's okay? She nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that answer, but the resignation in her eyes told me she wasn't done. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, anything. Just give me a chance to make it right. I looked at her, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. The logical part of me wanted to say no, to shut the door on this chapter and start fresh. But another part of me, the part that still held on to memories of the good times, couldn't let go that easily. We'd built a life together, a family. Could I really walk away from all of it? I don't know, Sarah, I finally said, my voice barely more than a whisper. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this. But, maybe we can try. For the kids. Relief washed over her face, and she reached out to take my hand. I let her, feeling the warmth of her touch, the familiarity of it, even as it felt foreign. Thank you, she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. I promise, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I nodded, the words feeling hollow. In that moment, I wanted to believe her, to believe that maybe, somehow, we could get past this. But deep down, I knew that things would never be the same. The trust we'd once shared was shattered, and no amount of therapy or apologies would ever bring it back. Over the next few weeks, we started therapy, going through the motions of healing. She was attentive, apologetic, doing everything she could to prove that she was committed to making things work. But each time I looked at her, I saw the lies, the betrayal. It was like a shadow that hung over us, a constant reminder of what she'd done. I tried to move on, to focus on the future, but the anger simmered beneath the surface, waiting to explode. I found myself questioning her every move, every smile, every glance. I was living in a prison of doubt, unable to break free. And no matter how hard she tried to reassure me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all a facade, a desperate attempt to fix something that was irreparably broken. One night, after a particularly tense therapy session, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the familiar weight of betrayal pressing down on me. I realized then that I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending, keep lying to myself. This wasn't a marriage, it was a slow, painful death of everything I'd once held dear. The next morning, I looked at her across the breakfast table, her face tired, the strain of the past few weeks evident in every line. She looked up, meeting my gaze, and I saw the hope in her eyes, the desperate belief that we could somehow salvage this. But I couldn't lie to her anymore. "Sarah," I said quietly, my voice steady. "I think it's time we face the truth. This, whatever we're doing here, it isn't working. I can't keep living like this." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw the woman I'd once loved, the woman who had been my partner, my confidant. But that woman was gone, lost to the lies and betrayal. "I understand," she whispered, her voice broken. "I never wanted it to end like this." "Neither did I," I replied, feeling the weight of the finality settle over me. We sat there, in silence, two strangers bound by a shared past but divided by an unforgivable betrayal. And in that silence, I knew that this was the end. The house was quiet that morning. Sarah had moved out the day before, taking only the essentials, leaving the rest of her things in boxes in the hallway. We had agreed to keep things civil for the kids' sake, to keep them from the fallout as much as possible. But it hadn't been easy. Each time I walked by the hall, those boxes were reminders of what had been, and what could never be again. The kids were spending the weekend with her, giving me space to breathe and finally sit with the silence. I thought I'd feel relief, maybe even peace. But instead, there was a strange emptiness, a hollowed-out feeling I couldn't shake. For years, this house had been our sanctuary, a place filled with laughter and warmth. Now it was a shell, a reminder of how quickly things could fall apart. I spent most of the day pacing, going through the motions, trying to figure out what to do next. I was exhausted from everything, worn down from the constant ache that had become my life. Part of me wanted to leave, to get in the car and drive until I couldn't remember her face, her lies, her betrayal. But another part of me was rooted here, tied to the memories of what we'd built, even if it was all gone now. Around dusk, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I opened it to find an older man standing on the porch. He looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place him. He was tall, with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything with a glance. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "Michael?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Yes. Can I help you?" He hesitated, looking past me into the house. "I'm Andrew's father," he said finally. "I thought we should talk." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Andrew. The man who had stolen my wife, the reason my life had come crashing down around me. For a second, I wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him to leave and take whatever message he had with him. But something in his expression made me pause. There was a weight there, a heaviness that mirrored my own. I stepped back, letting him in. We stood in the living room, the fading light casting long shadows across the floor. He looked around, taking in the emptiness, the packed boxes, the signs of a life that had unraveled. Finally, he turned to me, his face serious. I don't know if you're aware, he began, his voice thick, but Andrew passed away last week. For a moment, I couldn't process what he'd said. The words hung in the air, strange and surreal. Andrew was gone. The man who'd been the source of so much pain, so much destruction, was dead. I didn't know what to feel, relief, shock, maybe even anger. But as I looked at his father, I realized this wasn't the time for questions. I'm sorry, I managed, feeling awkward, unsure of what else to say. He nodded, a sadness in his eyes that ran deep. I know what he did, he said quietly. I know what happened between him and your wife. I don't expect you to forgive him, but I thought you should know the truth. I took a step back, feeling a flicker of anger. The truth? I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended. The truth is he destroyed my family. He lied to her, made her believe things that weren't real. He took everything from me. His father held up a hand, his face filled with a quiet resolve. That's what I came here to tell you, Michael. Andrew wasn't who you think he was. He struggled with things you may not understand. I frowned, trying to make sense of his words. What are you talking about? He looked away, a distant sadness in his gaze. Andrew had been battling mental illness for years. He hid it well, even from me. But in the end, it consumed him. He was reckless, impulsive, he thought he needed to prove something. To himself, to others. And he used your wife to do that. The words cut through me, filling me with a strange mix of emotions. I'd always seen Andrew as the villain, the one who'd ruined everything. But now, hearing this, I didn't know what to think. He wasn't just a thief, a liar, he was a man broken by his own demons. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it cast everything in a different light. So he was using her, I said slowly, the realization settling over me. His father nodded, his face somber. In a way, yes. He convinced himself that he needed her, that she was the answer to whatever was wrong inside him. But in the end, he destroyed himself. And I think, deep down, he knew it would end this way. I sat down, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I'd spent so long hating him, blaming him for everything. But now, faced with this truth, I felt empty. Andrew had been as lost as I was, maybe even more so. He hadn't just hurt me, he'd hurt himself, dragged Sarah down with him in his desperation. After a long silence, his father spoke again. I don't expect you to forgive him, Michael. But I thought you should know that he was struggling. He wasn't the monster you thought he was. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Part of me wanted to feel pity, to let go of the anger I'd been holding on to. But another part of me still clung to the hurt, the betrayal. This revelation didn't erase the damage he'd done, it just added another layer of complexity to an already twisted story. As he turned to leave, he paused, looking back at me. I know this doesn't fix anything. But maybe it'll give you a little peace. After he left, I sat alone in the empty house, replaying his words in my mind. Andrew had been fighting battles I couldn't see, battles he'd lost long before he'd ever met Sarah. It was a bitter, hollow truth, one that left me feeling as adrift as ever. But in a strange way, it gave me a sense of closure. I could let go of the hate, of the resentment. It wouldn't change what had happened, but it allowed me to take a step forward. The next morning, as I packed the last of Sarah's things, I felt a strange sense of calm. I wasn't healed, not by a long shot, but I was ready to start rebuilding. I'd been given a glimpse of the truth, a glimpse of the pain that had driven Andrew to his choices. It was a truth I hadn't asked for, but one that offered me a sliver of understanding, a way to move beyond the anger. As I closed the door behind me, I realized that this was the end of one chapter, and the beginning of another. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to walk it.